If you asked a tank crew in 1942 what they thought of the Churchill, you'd probably get a long list of complaints. Too slow. Outdated gun. Mechanical nightmares that broke down constantly. The thing looked like it had escaped from the trenches of World War I, with tracks wrapping all the way around its boxy hull like some prehistoric armored caterpillar. But here's the thing about the Churchill. It just wouldn't die. And that stubbornness, that refusal to quit, turned this homely British tank into one of the most reliable workhorses of the Second World War. The Churchill tank was never supposed to be beautiful. When British engineers sat down in 1939 to design a new infantry tank, they weren't thinking about sleek lines or impressive speed. They were thinking about the trenches of World War I. The British military establishment genuinely believed that the next war would be fought in similar conditions. Muddy battlefields, barbed wire everywhere, shell craters, and fortified positions that needed to be overcome. They needed a tank that could crawl over the worst terrain imaginable, absorb punishment, and keep moving forward with the infantry. Speed. That wasn't even in the top 10 priorities. The specification called for armor at least 80 millimeters thick to resist all known enemy anti-tank guns. The requested top speed was only 10 miles per hour. You read that right. 10 miles per hour, because if you're walking alongside infantry, you don't need to go fast. You just need to not die. The tank also needed to cross trenches, climb steep slopes, and navigate obstacles that would stop other vehicles cold. They wanted a crew of 7 and multiple weapons, 2 2-pounder guns and 3 machine guns. The original prototype, called the A-20, started trials in June 1940. But by then, France had already fallen. The lightning-fast German blitzkrieg had torn through Europe using speed, coordination, and mobile warfare. Not trench warfare. Not the slow grind everyone expected. Suddenly, the whole premise of the Churchill's design looked outdated. But Britain was desperate. With the threat of German invasion looming, they needed tanks, and they needed them fast. So production continued, and the design was rapidly modified into what became the Churchill Mark I. When the first Churchill tanks rolled off the production line in June 1941, they were a study in contradictions. The tank weighed nearly 40 tons and was covered in armor up to 102 millimeters thick at the front. That was genuinely impressive for early 1941, making it one of the most heavily armored tanks in the world at the time. The hull was constructed with flat armor plates, bolted or riveted to a mild steel frame. Those distinctive tracks that ran all the way around the hull weren't just for show. They meant the entire interior space within the track perimeter could be used, giving the Churchill a surprisingly roomy interior. This would later prove invaluable when converting the tank into specialist variants, but the armor came at a cost. The Churchill was powered by a Bedford 12-cylinder, horizontally opposed engine producing 350 horsepower. That might sound like a lot until you realize it was pushing 40 tons of steel. Top speed? About 15.5 miles per hour on roads. Cross-country, you were looking at more like 8 miles per hour. A person could jog faster than this tank could drive. The operational range was only about 90 miles before it needed refueling. Then there was the armament situation. Early Churchill tanks were bizarre by any standard. The Mark I had a 2-pounder gun in the turret with a coaxial machine gun. That was fine for 1940, but it also had a 3-inch howitzer mounted in the hull front. Yes, you read that correctly. A hull-mounted howitzer. The idea was that the turret gun would handle armor while the hull gun would blast fortifications and infantry positions. In practice, the hull gun could only fire in the direction the entire tank was pointing, making it almost useless. It could only fire smoke shells, which didn't help much when you're trying to support an infantry attack. The mechanical reliability was, to put it mildly, atrocious. Transmission problems plagued early models. Engines overheated, tracks broke, suspension components failed. Crews spent more time fixing their Churchills than fighting in them. There were so many problems that production was nearly canceled multiple times. The British Army seriously considered abandoning the whole Churchill program in favor of newer designs. The Churchill's baptism of fire came at Dieppe in August 1942, and it was a catastrophe. The raid on this French coastal town was supposed to be a large-scale test of amphibious assault tactics. Over 6,000 troops, mostly Canadian, were sent in with 58 Churchill tanks from the Calgary Regiment. It went horribly wrong. German coastal defenses were far stronger than expected. The element of surprise was lost when a German convoy spotted the approaching force. The tanks were supposed to land and support the infantry, but the beach at Dieppe was covered in large chert pebbles. These stones jammed into the Churchill's tracks and suspension, breaking track pins and immobilizing tanks. Many couldn't even get off the beach. Concrete obstacles prevented those that did from entering the town, but here's where things get interesting. While the raid was a tactical disaster with massive casualties, something remarkable emerged about the Churchill. Not a single Canadian crewman was killed while inside his tank. Think about that. The tanks were hit repeatedly by German anti-tank guns and artillery. But that thick armor? It worked. The Germans couldn't penetrate it. Churchills were abandoned on the beach, knocked out by mechanical failure or stuck on obstacles, but the armor had done its job. The crews survived to become prisoners of war, but they were alive. That armor thickness suddenly looked a lot more valuable. Late 1942 brought the Churchill's redemption. Churchill Mark III tanks equipped with the new 6-pounder gun were sent to North Africa to form a unit called King Force. They arrived just in time for the Second Battle of El Alamein. These 6 tanks absolutely proved themselves. Their thick armor made them nearly invulnerable to most German anti-tank guns at normal combat ranges. One Churchill reportedly took over 100 hits during the fighting and kept going. When 5 of these tanks participated in the battle, they claimed 5 enemy tanks and 3 anti-tank guns destroyed. More importantly, they survived engagement after engagement. The thick armor that had seemed like over-engineering suddenly looked brilliant. The Churchill really found its calling in Tunisia early 1943. This is where the tank's unusual characteristics became genuine advantages. The Tunisian terrain was mountainous, rocky, and difficult. Normal tanks struggled with the steep hills and rough ground. The Churchill excelled. Its long chassis and tracks that wrapped all around the hull gave it exceptional ground contact. The suspension system was robust. And that low top speed, it actually helped. Because the Churchill could climb slopes other tanks couldn't even attempt without tipping over or losing traction. At the Battle of Longstop Hill in April 1943, Churchills of the North Irish Horse did something that shocked even their own commanders. They drove straight up the heavily defended hill, a climb so steep that the Germans had assumed it was impossible for tanks. But the Churchill's low center of gravity, long tracks, and massive weight gave it traction where other tanks would have slid backward. The tanks came over the summit, catching the German defenders completely by surprise. One German officer, upon seeing Churchills appear at the top of the hill, reportedly said, "I knew all was over." Another German prisoner called them metal mules. The capture of Longstop Hill opened the road to Tunis and helped bring about the final Allied victory in North Africa. There's a famous story from Tunisia involving a Churchill Mark III and a German Tiger tank. The Tiger I was a 60-ton monster armed with the deadly 88mm gun and frontal armor so thick that Allied tank guns struggled to penetrate it. Tigers were feared, and rightly so, but one Churchill crew got incredibly lucky. During an engagement, a 6-pounder shell from the Churchill struck the Tiger's turret ring, jamming the turret so it couldn't rotate. Unable to bring its gun to bear, the Tiger crew had to abandon their vehicle. The British captured it intact. This was Tiger 131, which is now restored and on display at the Bovington Tank Museum. It's the only running Tiger I in the world, and it was captured because a Churchill got one incredibly lucky shot. By 1943, it was clear the Churchill needed better armament. The 6-pounder was adequate against most German armor in 1942, but the enemy wasn't standing still. Enter Captain Percy Morrell, a British officer working in a tank workshop in North Africa. He noticed Churchills being knocked out because the gun mantlet cast a shadow that gave German gunners a clear aiming point. He also noticed that the 6-pounder lacked high explosive shells, limiting its effectiveness against non-armored targets. Looking at wrecked Sherman tanks in the scrapyard, Morrell had an idea. The Sherman's 75mm gun was better for general-purpose work. Could it fit in a Churchill turret? Morrell was told he could try, but if he ruined a perfectly good Churchill, his career was over. He succeeded. The conversion worked, and over 200 Churchill tanks in the theater were retrofitted with 75mm guns taken from knocked-out Shermans. These became known as the Churchill NA-75, with NA standing for North Africa. The 75mm gave the Churchill a much better all-round weapon, and the tank finally had proper high-explosive shells for dealing with fortifications and infantry. Morrell was promoted to major for his ingenuity. The Churchill arrived in Italy in spring 1944, and this terrain was perfect for it. Italy's mountainous landscape, narrow roads, steep hills, and difficult ground would have challenged any tank. But the Churchill's climbing ability and low center of gravity made it invaluable. The tank supported infantry through the brutal battles for the Gothic Line throughout late 1944. The terrain was so challenging that other tanks simply couldn't go where the Churchill went. Crews learned to trust the tank's ability to traverse seemingly impossible slopes. The Churchill could turn on the spot thanks to its advanced transmission system, crucial when maneuvering on narrow mountain roads. But the biggest evolution came with the Mark VII, introduced in late 1943 and first seeing combat in Normandy in June 1944. The Mark VII was essentially a heavily upgraded Churchill. The frontal armor was increased to 152 millimeters, 50% thicker than a Tiger I's frontal armor. Yes, you read that right. The Churchill Mark VII had thicker frontal armor than a Tiger. The sides and turret were also significantly better protected. The Mark VII used welded construction instead of riveting, which was stronger and required less labor to produce. It mounted the British 75mm gun as standard. The catch? The engine was still the same 350 horsepower Bedford unit. With all that extra armor, the Churchill Mark VII was now painfully slow. Maximum speed dropped even further, but by this point, nobody cared about the speed anymore. The Churchill had found its niche as the ultimate infantry support tank. It could survive hits that would destroy other tanks, it could go places other tanks couldn't, and it kept moving forward. This brings us to the specialist variants, and this is where the Churchill's story gets really interesting. The tank's spacious interior, strong chassis, and reliable survivability made it the perfect platform for specialized combat engineering vehicles. These became known as Hobarts Funnies, after Major General Percy Hobart, who championed their development for the D-Day invasion. The Churchill AVRE, which stood for Assault Vehicle Royal Engineers, was designed to destroy fortifications. It replaced the main gun with a petard spigot mortar that fired a 40-pound high-explosive charge nicknamed the Flying Dustbin. With a maximum range of only 230 yards, you had to get close. But when that round hit a bunker or pillbox, it was devastatingly effective. The AVRE could also carry fascines, which were huge bundles of wood that could be dropped into trenches to allow the tank to cross. It could carry bridge sections, explosive charges, and various other engineering equipment. 180 AVREs were ready for D-Day. The Churchill Crocodile was even more terrifying. This was a Churchill Mark VII with a flamethrower. The hull-mounted machine gun was replaced with a flame projector connected by an armored pipe to a 6.5-ton armored trailer towed behind the tank. This trailer carried 1,800 liters of fuel and pressurized gas. The Crocodile could fire about 80 one-second bursts of flame, each reaching out 120 to 150 yards. Unlike other flamethrower tanks, the Crocodile kept its turret-mounted 75mm gun, so it could fight as a regular tank when needed. The psychological effect of the Crocodile was immense. German troops facing bunkers would often see a Crocodile fire a demonstration burst within view. Many positions surrendered immediately rather than face that weapon. When they didn't surrender, the AVRE would crack open the fortification with its petard mortar, and then the Crocodile would pour flame through the breach. It was a 1-2 punch that was nearly impossible to withstand. 800 Crocodile kits were produced, and they served with such effectiveness that German troops began specifically targeting them. There's at least one recorded case of a captured Crocodile crew being executed in revenge for using the weapon. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, specialized Churchill variants were crucial to the success of the invasion. AVREs filled craters, destroyed obstacles, and cleared paths through minefields. Crocodiles burned out German bunkers covering the beaches. Churchill bridge layer variants positioned spans over anti-tank ditches. Churchill Arc variants drove into gaps and became instant bridges that other vehicles could drive over. These weren't sexy or glamorous vehicles, but they were absolutely essential. Throughout the Northwest Europe campaign from 1944 to 1945, Churchill tanks supported British and Commonwealth infantry through some of the war's toughest fighting. They fought through the bocage country of Normandy, where the thick hedgerows and sunken roads favored defenders. They supported operations in the Low Countries. They pushed into Germany itself during operations like Veritable, the assault on the Reichswald forest. The Churchill was never the best tank in any single category. German Panthers had better guns and better sloped armor. American Shermans were faster and more reliable. Soviet T-34s were cheaper and produced in greater numbers. But the Churchill had something else. It was tough as nails and kept going. Crews learned they could count on it to survive hits and bring them home. That built trust, and that trust was worth more than raw specifications. The Churchill also had better crew survivability than comparable tanks. It was less prone to catastrophic fires when penetrated. The thick armor meant penetrations were rarer in the first place. The spacious interior meant the crew wasn't cramped together where a single shell could kill everyone. Tankers fighting in Churchills had better survival rates than those in Shermans or Crusaders. When you're the one inside the tank, that matters more than anything else on the spec sheet. By war's end, approximately 5,640 Churchills had been produced, making it the second most produced British tank after the Valentine. The tank served in North Africa, Italy, Northwest Europe, and even saw limited action in Burma. After the war, some Churchills remained in British service into the early 1950s. Churchill Crocodiles and Mark VII tanks were used in Korea, proving the design still had value even against a new enemy in a new war. The Churchill's legacy is one of persistence overcoming initial failure. It started as an outdated design with serious flaws. Early combat performance was disastrous. The tank was nearly canceled multiple times. But gradually, through upgrades, through tactical evolution, and through the hard-won experience of the crews who operated it, the Churchill became indispensable. Its climbing ability saved lives in Tunisia and Italy. Its armor saved countless crew members who would have died in thinner-skinned tanks. Its reliability, once the mechanical problems were sorted out, meant it was there when needed. There's a reason it was named after Winston Churchill, the man who famously said, "Never give in, never give in, never, never, never." The tank embodied that spirit. It wasn't the fastest, it wasn't the most powerful, and it certainly wasn't pretty. But the Churchill was tough, reliable, and utterly stubborn. It refused to quit. It refused to die, and in the end, that was exactly what the British Army needed. The slow British brick that everyone wanted to cancel became the tank that helped win the war. Sometimes, refusing to die is the greatest victory of all. Thank you for watching until the end. You can click in these other videos if you like this one. Don't forget to like and subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified when we upload a new video. Have a good day.